Here's what's coming up on the world today. Jury finds former U.S. President Donald Trump sexually abused writer E. Jean Carroll in civil case. UK, U.S. to support Ukraine until successful conclusion of conflict. Plus, knife attacks erupt in Poland and Japan, leaving victims dead and injured. Hello and welcome to the program. Today, I'm Susan Ilian. We begin with legal matters where a jury in a civil case has found former President Donald Trump sexually abused a magazine columnist in a New York department store in the 1990s. Mr. Trump was found not liable for raping E. Jean Carroll in the dressing room of Bergdorf Goodman. The jury also found Mr. Trump liable for defamation for calling the writer's accusations a hoax and a lie. The Manhattan jury of 6 men and 3 women who reached their decision after less than 3 hours of deliberations ordered Mr. Trump to pay E. Jean Carroll approximately $5 million in damages.
I think it's an inconsistent verdict, right? And it's something that obviously will be another issue for appeal. But Jim, the issue for the appeals were laid really months ago when things like, Donald Trump's attempt to have the dress tested for DNA after they sent it into a lab and didn't come up with semen. I think that's something that was important. The fact that the Reid Hoffman, the Democratic financier, who Ms. Carroll was not candid about when she testified initially under oath in her deposition, that should come into this case. The Access Hollywood tape should not have come into this case. There's a federal rule called 403 that balances out inflammatory and prejudicial things, and that certainly was one of them. So, but there's plenty of issues to appeal. And look, that's what happens, right? We're in one sense gratified, and I know some people in this camp are very happy that the rape claim was rejected, but I'm not, and I am happy about that, certainly, but I'm not happy that he was found liable for anything whatsoever, because on this evidence, I didn't think he should have been.
Meanwhile, former U.S. President Donald Trump said he would appeal the verdict in the E. Jean Carroll civil trial after he was ordered to pay $5 million in damages for sexually abusing the magazine writer and then defaming her by branding her a liar. Mr. Trump said this is another scam and a political witch hunt.
What else can you expect from a Trump-hating, Clinton-appointed judge who went out of his way to make sure that the result of this trial was as negative as it could possibly be, speaking to and in control of a jury from an anti-Trump area, which is probably the worst place in the United States for me to get a fair trial? We'll be appealing this decision. It's a disgrace. I don't even know who this woman is. I have no idea who she is, where she came from. This is another scam. It's a political witch hunt. And somehow we're going to have to fight this stuff. We cannot let our country go into this abyss. This is disgraceful. You have somebody running for office. You have a woman that's financed and lied about it. She totally lied about it by Democrat operatives, like just about the biggest one there is. And she said that wasn't true. They found that she lied about it, and the judge wasn't even, I guess, letting it be put in as evidence. The whole thing is a scam, and it's a shame, and it's a disgrace to our country.
Joining me now is U.S. and international affairs analyst Calvin Dark. Calvin, welcome to the program. Let's start off with what you make of all of these controversies surrounding former U.S. President Donald Trump, Calvin.
Well, there certainly are a lot of them. It's not only this that happened yesterday, but there's the criminal case in Manhattan, with the payments to Stormy Daniels. There's a federal case about January 6th. There's the case in the state of Georgia about interfering in the 2020 election. So there's no shortage of legal scandals and controversies that Trump is a part of. But, I'll just, remind you, one of the nicknames that Trump has here is Teflon Don. that nothing sticks to him, and things that would end the political career for essentially anybody else never seem to take Trump down. So we'll see if this is going to be any different.
Indeed, we will. And this is the first time Mr. Trump has been found legally responsible for a sexual assault, and the first time a former president of the United States has been found liable for sexual abuse and battery. Why did this case come up now? I mean, 30 years after?
Yes, it's a horrible precedent, and it's an embarrassing one for the U.S. presidency. I think the timing, there are three basic reasons. The first reason is, in general, I think society is treating sexual assault differently. We're paying attention to accusations in ways we weren't, say, 10 years ago. We're understanding that the ways that victims respond and how they act after varies. And so I think that's one reason. I think the second reason is in New York, at the end of last year, there was a law passed that basically gave a year window for people to bring these types of claims that would have otherwise not been allowed because of a statute of limitations. And so E. Jean Carroll took advantage of that. And then the third reason would be that, E. Jean Carroll even said herself that she saw during the presidency of Donald Trump, there were dozens of accusations, some going back as far as the 70s, some happening, pretty recently, that he wasn't answering to, that he was being held in impunity for. And so she brought this in an effort to make him at least answer to these claims. So I think that's why we see the timing now so many years later.
And really looking at all of the issues surrounding the former president, particularly the most recent indictment, Calvin, what does this say about the political future of Mr. Trump, especially with regards to running for president again?
Well, I think that now this is up to the Republican voters. Like I said, most politicians wouldn't be able to survive anything like this, partly because of the shame and embarrassment factor. That's not a thing with Donald Trump. So this is not going to make Donald Trump stop or in any way slow down his campaign for the Republican nomination and for the White House. It's now up to Republicans to decide if this is the candidate they want to represent them. And from a purely political standpoint, is this the best candidate they can present to actually win, given all of this controversy and baggage?
All right, and my final question to you, Calvin. One might say all these allegations unfolding at the same time are strategies directly or perhaps even indirectly to get Mr. Trump out of the political system, even as the 2024 presidential election is, upon us. Do you agree that there's some sort of strategy against the former president?
No, as much as the former president would like to say there's a strategy, it's always a witch hunt, always a Democratic persecution. It's not. And, there are a lot of people that would like for it to be a strategy. Most of them are Republicans, those who want to win and don't want to have Donald Trump as their candidate. But I think what we have to realize is all of these things, be it from the criminal charge with the Stormy Daniels, be it E. Jean Carroll, what's happening in Georgia, what's happening in the federal courts in D.C., these were all things that Donald Trump did. Some of them bury at the end of his presidency. These aren't things that people created, even those who don't want to be in politics. If they'd wanted to create it, they couldn't. So I think that this is working towards getting him out of the 2024 process. But it's Donald Trump who's responsible because they're things that he's alleged to have done.
All right. Well, Calvin, thank you very much for your contributions and analysis on the program.
Thank you.
And U.S. President Joe Biden and top lawmakers agreed to further talks aimed at breaking a deadlock over raising the $31.4 trillion U.S. debt limit, with just 3 weeks before the country may be forced into an unprecedented default. Mr. Biden, a Democrat, and House of Representatives Speaker Kevin McCarthy, a Republican, committed their aides to daily discussions about areas of possible agreement as a default looms as soon as June 1st. The U.S. president called the talks productive and appeared to offer Republicans some possible compromises, including taking a hard look for the first time at clawing back unspent coronavirus relief funds to reduce government spending. But he repeated that Republicans must take the threat of default off the table.
First, I just finished, I thought, a productive meeting with the congressional leadership about the path forward to make sure America does not default, emphasize does not default on this debt for the first time in our history. I'm pleased, but not surprised to hear Republican minority leader of the United States Senate saying that at our meeting that the United States is not going to default, never has, and it never will. He's absolutely correct. We agreed to continue our discussions, and we're going to meet again on Friday. In the meantime, our staffs are going to meet today and daily between now and then, and everyone in the meeting understood the risk of default. Our economy would fall into a significant recession. It would devastate retirement accounts, increase borrowing costs. According to Moody's, nearly 8 million Americans would lose their jobs, and our international reputation would be damaged in the extreme. The last part is me, international. Moody's did not say the last part about damage in the extreme. I made clear during our meeting that default is not an option. Repeated that time and again. America is not a deadbeat nation. We pay our bills, and avoiding default is a basic duty of the United States Congress. And I'll remind you, the national debt went up 40% over the 200-year, went up 40% under my predecessor. And that's the problem we're dealing with today. I might note parenthetically, in my first 2 years, I reduced the debt by $1.7 trillion. No president's ever done that. I told congressional leaders that I'm prepared to begin a separate discussion about my budget and the spending priorities, but not under the threat of default. I made it clear that we can cut spending and cut the deficit. For example, my budget cuts $200 billion in spending by strengthening Medicare's power to negotiate for lower prescription drug prices. In addition, that's on top of the $160 billion in budget savings we passed last year by being able to reduce the price of insulin and other drugs for those on Medicare. And my budget cuts $30 billion in spending on tax subsidies for big oil companies. They made $200 billion. They don't need a $30 billion subsidy to drill. It makes no sense.
Former Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan has been presented in an Islamabad court amid hearings of the Al-Qadr Trust case for which he was arrested yesterday. According to media reports, prosecutor of the National Accountability Bureau requested the court for a 14-day physical remand of the ex-PM, a move which was opposed by his lawyers. Pakistan grapples with the aftermath of protests that erupted across the country, where nearly 1,000 people were arrested. Pakistan's Interior Ministry has called in the army to maintain law and order in the eastern province of Punjab in aid of civil power. In various cities, including Khan's hometown of Lahore, buildings were burnt and debris, including charred vehicles, blocked the road, disrupting traffic. Meanwhile, tensions rose in the Gaza Strip as fears grew of further violence, highlighted when one person was killed and one wounded in an Israeli airstrike in southern Gaza. Shops and banks were closed, fishing boats stayed at anchor, and streets were largely empty. It comes as Israel killed 3 Islamic Jihad commanders in Gaza and at least 10 civilians, including several children, drawing threats of reprisals and warnings of a further escalation in fighting. The strikes were the latest in an extended period of Israeli-Palestinian violence stretching back more than a year. In all, at least 15 Palestinians were killed in the deadly strikes. Over in Poland, where a 19-year-old man gained access to an orphanage, killing a teenage girl and injuring 9 other people in a knife attack. According to the police, 5 people were hospitalized as a result of the incident, but their lives were not in danger. while 4 others were treated on the spot. Spokesperson for the provincial police headquarters, Aneta Soberaj, said the attacker was arrested at his place of residence about an hour after the incident and did not put up any resistance. He was sober at the time of his arrest, but the police were also testing for drugs. Authorities say the other children from the orphanage are receiving psychological care, adding that at the time of the attack, 13 people were at the orphanage, including 1 employee. And from one stabbing to another, but this time in Japan, where a 13-year-old junior high school student was stabbed on his way to school in Tokyo. According to authorities, the suspect was identified as a man in his 60s and was arrested near the scene of the attack in Tokyo's Ota Ward, where a blood-stained knife was found. The victim, whose injuries are not believed to be life-threatening, was taken to the hospital. Police said that the assailant has since admitted to the stabbing and are further investigating the crime scene and collecting evidence where the stabbing occurred. A spokesperson for the Human Rights Office said Iran has executed 209 people so far this year, describing its record as abominable and calling for them to halt. Speaking at a Geneva press briefing, spokeswoman for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ravina Shamdasani, said, on average so far this year, over 10 people are put to death each week in Iran, making it one of the world's highest executors.
The UN Human Rights Chief, Volker Turk, today expressed dismay at the frighteningly high number of executions this year in Iran. We call on the authorities to follow the lead of most other states and to abolish the death penalty or to halt all executions. On average, so far this year, over 10 people are put to death each week in Iran, making it one of the world's highest executors. Since the 1st of January, sources say that at least 209 people have been executed, mostly for drug-related offenses, and a disproportionately high number representing minorities. The exact number of executions is unknown due to lack of government transparency, and the figure is likely to be higher. At this rate, Iran is worryingly on the same track as last year, when around 580 people were reportedly executed. This is an abominable record, particularly when you consider the growing consensus for universal abolition of the death penalty.
The paramilitary Rapid Support Forces have accused the Sudanese armed forces of launching airstrikes against the country's old presidential palace in the capital, Khartoum. They added that they would reply decisively. Residents of the city reported heavy bombing of the area, but the army has denied the RSF's claim. The old Republican Palace is located along the Blue Nile River near the current premises that were inaugurated in January 2015. The two warring parties have been holding peace talks in Saudi Arabia, but there is little sign of progress. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Tuesday says the United States will not give up on the goal of putting Sudan back on track to civilian democratic governance, adding that Washington is working in talks in Jeddah to extend the ceasefire and get agreement on the provision of humanitarian aid. Talks began Saturday between the Army and the rival paramilitary Rapid Support Forces in the Saudi-led city of Jeddah. Residents of Sudan's capital reported airstrikes overnight and sporadic gun battles on Tuesday amid what they said was a surge in looting, with no sign of progress in ceasefire talks taking place in Saudi Arabia.
We continue to engage directly with Sudanese civilian leaders, with Sudanese civil society, with the goal of putting their nation back on the track to civilian democratic governance. That's the goal that we share, and a goal that we will not give up on. Together now, we are pressing the warring parties in Sudan to put down their guns and allow life-saving aid to reach the Sudanese people. We have diplomats from the United States and Saudi Arabia deeply engaged in talks in Jeddah, working in close consultation with counterparts from the UK, the United Arab Emirates, the African Union, and other multilateral partners. The collective aim that we have is to lay the foundation for further negotiations between the parties that we hope can lead to a permanent cessation of hostilities. But in the first instance, we're working in Jeddah to extend the ceasefire and get agreement on the provision of humanitarian assistance to the people of Sudan. Today, I also had the chance to thank James for the United Kingdom's crucial cooperation in getting citizens of both of our countries out of Sudan. These joint efforts allowed UK aircraft to evacuate more than 2,000 people, including US citizens, from dangerous and unpredictable conditions. And they were indispensable to the evacuation of hundreds of additional US citizens through Port Sudan. All told, we supported the evacuation of more than 1,300 Americans from Sudan in collaboration with our partners.
After the break, Ukraine releases video showing artillery fire near Bakhmut. Details in a moment. Stay with us. A Saudi plane carrying approximately 20 tons of food, medicine, and shelter supplies landed in Port Sudan late yesterday, even as the country falls further into a war that has been on for more than 3 weeks. Fighting in Sudan's capital escalated on this morning with fierce clashes and airstrikes as delegations of rival military factions continued talks in Saudi Arabia aimed at securing a ceasefire and humanitarian relief. Residents reported ground battles in several neighborhoods of Khartoum between the army and the paramilitary rapid support forces, and heavy gunfire in the north of Omdurman and the east of Bahri, two adjacent cities separated from Khartoum by the River Nile. Members of the Beja tribe, which has in the past mobilized in support of the army by closing off Port Sudan, staged a demonstration in the Sudanese city, pledging allegiance to the military. The tribe members marched the streets of Port Sudan and chanted in support of the army leader, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, in his fight against the paramilitary rapid support forces. Protesters demanded armaments to fight alongside the army. The Beja tribe had in the past blocked roads and forced Red Sea ports to close in protest for what they say is the region's lack of political power and poor economic conditions there. The closures led to shortages of essential medicines, fuel, and wheat. Their protest comes as Sudanese are pinning their hopes on talks in Saudi Arabia between envoys of warring factions to end bloodshed that has killed hundreds and triggered a mass exodus. According to figures from the International Organization for Migration, more than 700,000 people have fled their homes in Sudan to escape from fighting between rival military fractions. It was not immediately clear if they were heading to Sudan's 7 international borders, over which at least 150,000 people have crossed, according to data from the UN Refugee Agency. IOM spokesperson Paul Dillon told a press conference in Geneva that more than 700,000 people were now displaced within Sudan since fighting began. Now that's up from 340,000 reported last week.
The number of people internally displaced in Sudan has more than doubled in the last week, according to data that's been collected by the International Organization for Migration's Displacement Tracking Matrix. Now, more than 700,000 people are now internally displaced by the fighting, which began on the 15th of April, according to this latest data. Last Tuesday, the figure stood at 340,000. And of course, prior to the fighting, an estimated 3.7 million people were internally displaced in Sudan. Now, this latest report identifies increases in IDPs in multiple areas, in the White Nile, River Nile, Northern State, and Al Jazeera State, as well as parts of Khartoum State and the capital, where clashes are continuing. Many IDPs are sheltering with relatives, while others are gathering in schools, mosques, and public buildings, scenes that we see repeatedly over and over again around the world. Their intentions not yet clear. Of course, decisions that people are making to move are influenced by so many different factors. Events on the battlefield and the extent to which conflict is encroaching upon their communities are one. But of course, it's very difficult right now to find money. The ATMs aren't working. The banking system is not functioning. Fuel is difficult to come by and expensive. We've heard many reports of the costs of boarding interstate transport are increasing dramatically. So there are quite a number of factors at play here before we can make any determination about what the intentions are.
Let's talk to Ibrahim Anoba, African Affairs analyst, who joins us from California. Welcome to the program, Ibrahim. Now, over the weekend, U.S.-Saudi mediated talks did take place in the city of Jeddah to find a way to stop the war from escalating in Sudan. Now, how does that influence the conflict if the warring sides are still carrying on with fighting in the capital, Khartoum, and really failing to adhere to a ceasefire?
Well, thanks for having me, Susan. So the talks in Jeddah weren't really to consider any kind of diplomatic end to the conflict. It was primarily about humanitarian aid, allowing aid to come into Sudan. And of course, the RSF and the army have made it clear they are not in any way ready to have conversations about ending this civil war. It's more so about humanitarian. However, I think it also speaks to the fact that now the international community is paying greater attention to the crisis in Sudan, not only to give both generals leeway as they've been given in the past, but also to consider solutions beyond the military. So there might not be conversations about democratic transition right now, but the effort by the US, by the UN, by Saudi Arabia to bring these generals or their representatives to Jeddah signify that they could also be considering some democratic transition.
And so the United Nations has estimated that the number of internally displaced in Sudan has risen to more than 700,000 people, mostly people who have had to flee to neighboring countries because of the fighting. Now, given this scenario, does this put the burden on the countries taking in the refugees?
I mean, it does. You look at the countries taking these refugees, they are already plagued by their own internal displacements and security crisis. I mean, you look at the countries welcoming majority of refugees from Sudan right now.
Have it ready when I need to talk.
South Sudan is already very pretty much devastated by its own internal security crisis. Remember, there was a flood in 2022 that displaced thousands of people. And before now, there is hunger crisis. It's a country at the brink of famine. You look at a country like Chad, which is also welcoming refugees from Sudan. Chad has been plagued by the attacks by Boko Haram over the years. You look at the Central African Republic, it also has its own internal strife. And even Ethiopia, which is pretty much the big brother in the region, has about 2.3 million people displaced because of the war in the Tigray region. So, I mean, you look at all these neighboring countries, they have their own internal displacements, and it brings a lot of pressure on their infrastructure and their ability to entertain these people living in Sudan that desperately need assistance in the respective countries that they are going to.
Would you say that it's safe to say that this crisis is really a power struggle between the Sudanese army and the rapid support forces? And if that's the case, who's in control as it stands now?
I mean, it is purely a power struggle between these two greedy generals, and there doesn't seem to be any clear indication of who is in charge. There were reports coming out of Khartoum yesterday that there have been massive airstrikes by the army on RSF positions, and the RSF having surface-to-air missiles repelling some of those attacks. I mean, this is the same narrative we've had in the last couple of weeks. So there doesn't seem to be an indication that the army is in charge, even though many in the international community want the army to be in charge. Egypt supports the army, supports Burhan. There are indications that even the US may also be indicating some interest in pursuing some form of stability through the army, even though its long-term intention is for the country to have democratic transition. However, there doesn't seem to be any form of control, which is also making humanitarian relief effort difficult. The UNHCR is often known to work with infrastructures in places where people need assistance. However, when you do not have an indication of who is in charge, it's really difficult to make aid go to people who actually need those aid. So I don't think neither the army or the RSF can claim authority in Sudan at this point.
And let me ask you this, Ibrahim. Now, is this becoming a kind of proxy war? The reason I ask is that there are reports that the Wagner Group have been supplying Sudan's rapid support forces with missiles. And then you have the fact that reports of Hemedti being close ties with Russia. What do you make of all of that?
I mean, we wouldn't want to ignore that fact because, of course, it's clear the Wagner Group is very much active in Sudan and the region generally. And, of course, there has been a report by the Washington Post, and I think maybe CNN as well, indicating that there have been smuggling of gold out of Sudan by the Wagner Group to fund Russia's war in Ukraine. And of course, in return, many of these army persons in Sudan are getting firearms. I mean, Sudan doesn't manufacture its own gun. It doesn't manufacture its own bomb. So we are seeing all this still perpetrating the crisis in Khartoum and elsewhere. So the guns are coming from somewhere. And the fact that these generals are still able to conduct trade, even if it's the clandestine or black market trade, to buy weapons, it means there are still people in the international system, state actors or non-state actors, who are supporting these generals. And until sanctions come down heavily on those who are supporting both generals, I do not think there will be any yield by either party.
Well, let's look at this from an economic perspective, Ibrahim. If this crisis is to come to an end, eventually, how does the country scale up efforts and pick up the pieces in terms of rebuilding and transitioning back to a more stable economy?
I mean, you know what, Susan, before now, Sudan is already ravaged by a lot of economic crisis. I mean, about 30% of its population lives below the poverty line. And I think close to 20% of the country is actually unemployed as well. And it also has one of the highest level of inflation on the continent, I think about 400%. So you think about all these economic figures, you already see a country in dire need of economic revamping before this crisis, then bring in this crisis, which has destroyed a lot of transportation infrastructure, caused a lot of trade relations with many neighboring countries like South Sudan. A lot of investors that have actually fled the country. SMEs have gone down. So you see a lot of economic edict that will come into play for any government that win or succeeds this crisis. So it's an unfortunate situation, that economic situation that is already dire because of famine, droughts, climate change, COVID-19, now being exacerbated by this civil war. And it's just so unfortunate that the Sudanese people are in the front line bearing those brunt.
My final question to you, could this crisis cause an economic turmoil in the Horn of Africa?
I mean, I think we're already seeing that because Sudan is strategically located on the Red Sea, and it's the outlet for many countries like, I think, the Central African Republic and Chad, who do not have access to, I mean, these countries do not have access to any waters. And Sudan is pretty much their only outlet into the Red Sea. So if Sudan is already plagued by a crisis, it means many of these countries cannot, conduct trade through the Red Sea. So it's really important that Sudan gets stabilized really soon, so not to continue exacerbate the internally displaced refugee problem, but also about the economic situation in the entire region, which is already plagued by insecurity. So you don't want to have insecurity and have economic insecurity at the same time. So the more we consider that as this negotiation goes on, the better it is for everybody in the region.
All right, thank you very much, Ibrahim Anoba, our African Affairs analyst from California. Appreciate you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Updates on Russia's invasion of Ukraine now. The United Nations said inspections resumed yesterday of outbound vessels under a deal allowing the safe Black Sea export of Ukraine grain. The UN and Turkey brokered the Black Sea export agreement in July to help tackle a global food crisis that has been worsened by Moscow's war in Ukraine. Officials from Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the UN made up a joint coordination center in Istanbul, which implements the deal.
To information who led the effort. Last night, our colleagues at the Office for the Black Sea Grain Initiative reported that the Joint Coordination Center had conducted no inspections on Sunday and Monday. The JCC has confirmed that inspections have resumed today on outbound vessels. According to information shared by the Ukrainian delegation with the parties of the JCC, there are 62 vessels waiting to move to Ukrainian ports. Out of these, 8 applications have been sent to the JCC for registration. The Office of the UN Coordinator and the delegation of Turkey are working closely with all sides with the aim to facilitate movements and inspections of inbound and outbound vessels within the framework of the initiative and agreed procedures while discussions for the future of the initiative continue. We do expect some high-level meeting to happen this week. You'll recall that on Friday there was an expert-level meeting in Istanbul, and hopefully that will be followed up in the coming days with a senior level meeting. I think we're doing as much as we can to have this grain deal extended as often as needs to happen. And so he's working assiduously with different leaders on that. As you know, Martin Griffiths and Rebecca Greenspan are also dealing with various parties, and we'll see what can be done.
Meanwhile, United Nations aid chief Martin Griffiths is traveling to Turkey as a high-level meeting with Ankara, Russia, Ukraine, and the UN is scheduled on May 10 and 11 in Istanbul to discuss the Black Sea grain deal. UN Deputy Spokesperson Farhan Haq told reporters that Griffiths left Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, for Istanbul. Russia wants obstacles to exports of its fertilizer to be removed for it to agree to another extension of the grain deal, which was signed in Istanbul last July among the 4 parties. However, the deal is set to expire in May the 18th. British Foreign Minister James Cleverly says the UK and the US have the strategic endurance to support Ukraine in the war against Russia until its successful conclusion. Mr. Cleverly joined U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken during a news briefing in Washington, D.C., where he said both countries will continue to support Ukraine in spite of the outcome that the forthcoming offensive generates. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the United States will provide a new defense package worth a total amount of $1.2 billion. The United States announced earlier that a new $1.2 billion military and package aid for Ukraine will include air defense systems, ammunition, and funds for training. Ukraine's Security Assistance Initiative funds will be used to purchase the weapons, allowing U.S. President Joe Biden's administration to buy weapons from industry rather than pull them from U.S. stocks. Now, in the package, Ukraine will receive additional air defense systems and munitions, as well as the technology to integrate Western air defense launchers, missiles, and radars with Ukraine's native defense systems. According to the Pentagon, the funds will pay for 155-millimeter howitzer ammunition, counter-drone ammunition, satellite imagery, and various types of training. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte discussed the war in Ukraine with Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and said there should be no concessions that affect Ukrainian sovereignty. Mr. Lula has been advocating the creation of a group of nations not involved in the war that can broker peace talks to end the conflict and has suggested concessions from both sides. Mr. Rutte, on a 3-day visit to Brazil, laid out the European position regarding the need to defend Ukraine from Russian aggression. The Brazilian leader insisted that peace talks were needed to stop the fighting, noting that Brazil voted for the United Nations resolution condemning the Russian invasion.
I'm glad we were able to talk about the war in Ukraine today. We would all like to see the war end as soon as possible, without making concessions that affect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. In our meeting, I stressed that the Netherlands will support Ukraine for as long as it is necessary.
When we return, late Princess Diana's Swan Lake suit hits the auction block in New York. Stay with us. Welcome back. British Foreign Minister James Cleverly says the UK and the US have the strategic endurance to support Ukraine in the war against Russia until its successful conclusion.
Foreign Secretary.
From the UK's point of view, we'll of course also continue to provide financial and military aid. We intend to give the Ukrainians the tools they need to successfully defend themselves against the invasion. The message that we send now is really important. I think the message that we should send is that when we commit to something, we stick with it. We have the grit, we have the determination, we have the strategic endurance to see it through until its successful conclusion. And anyone watching should learn that lesson. And we need to continue to support them, irrespective of whether this forthcoming offensive generates, huge gains on the battlefield, because until this conflict is resolved and resolved properly, it is not over. This is not a film. There are no certainties when it comes to conflict. The Ukrainians have consistently outperformed expectations, but there can be no guarantees in war.
We're also working hand in hand, as we have been for well more than a year now, to provide support for Ukraine as it defends its people and its territory against Russia's war of aggression. We applaud the UK's pledge to match in 2023 the $2.3 billion in military support that it provided to Ukraine during the first year of the war. We also talked about the urgent need to extend and expand the Black Sea Grain Initiative. In recent days, Russia has once again returned to blocking ships from sailing to Ukraine's ports to pick up the grain, a cynical action that directly results in less food getting to global markets and to human beings in Africa, in the Middle East, and around the world who need that food. While we're grateful for the tireless efforts of Secretary General Guterres and our colleagues in Turkey working to break this impasse, the world shouldn't need to remind Moscow every few weeks to stop using people's hunger as a weapon in their war against Ukraine.
A Ukrainian unit commander said a Ukrainian howitzer battery fired shells on Russian mortar positions near Avdiivka. Andriy, the senior officer of the battery, said that after 3 to 4 fired shells, Russian forces would answer with their own fire. Russia has stepped up its attacks in anticipation of a Ukrainian counteroffensive after Moscow's winter campaign captured little territory despite the bloodiest ground combat in Europe since World War II. Meanwhile, Ukraine armed forces released video showing multiple launch rocket systems firing near Bakhmut. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russian forces had failed to capture the eastern city of Bakhmut before the May 9 Russian holiday, marking the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. Fierce fighting in Bakhmut has lasted months, and Moscow sees capturing the city as a stepping stone to taking other cities in Ukraine's eastern industrial heartland. Britain's King Charles visited the Whittle Laboratory in Cambridge in his first public engagement since being crowned at his coronation over the weekend. King Charles took a short tour of the facility, which is a leading global center for innovation in net zero aviation and energy, before breaking the ground outside. He gave a short speech where he praised the laboratory's work, afterwards watched on by British lawmaker Grant Shapps. King Charles and Queen Camilla were crowned at London's Westminster Abbey on Saturday in Britain's biggest ceremonial event in 70 years.
And if we continue on the trajectory as normal.
International head of jewelry at Christie's, Rahul Kadahia, says the 700-piece jewelry collection of the late Austrian billionaire Heidi Horton, the world's largest and most valuable collection of its kind, could be auctioned and could sell for more than $150 million. Some of the most spectacular pieces, including the 90-carat Briolet of India, diamond necklace by Harry Winston, and the Sunrise Ruby, and diamond ring by Cartier that is worth up to $20 million. The collection, acquired between the early 1970s until Horton's death, is also comprised of 100 Bulgari pieces. Horton's collection is set to exceed the record sales at Christie's for Elizabeth Taylor's collection in 2011, amid the Maharajas and Mughal Magnificence auction in 2019, the only two jewelry collections to have garnered more than $100 million.
There is, of course, the Sunrise Ruby. It's a 25-carat Burma ruby, estimated at $15 to $20 million. There is the Briolet of India, a 90-carat D color, the whitest Briolet drop that's estimated between $10 and $15 million. We also have one of the finest natural pearl necklaces, Oriental pearls, 3 strands, with an 11-carat pink diamond clasp, quite rare, which we've estimated between $7 and $10 million. What's important is that we have been completely transparent. We are selling this collection in its identity with the name Horton. We're not disclosing the name. It's not being sold as an anonymous collection. We are being fully transparent of where the funds are going. The Horton proceeds will go towards a foundation who will help child protection and welfare, medical research, and access to the arts. Christie's on its own is giving a separate donation towards Holocaust research and education. So we've put all the facts out for our clients, and they have the opportunity to choose if they wish to participate in the sale or not.
And finally on the program, Princess Diana's Swan Lake suit. The jewels worn by the late princess at her final public appearance will hit the auction block in New York on June 27th. The Swan Lake suit became priceless when the late Princess Diana donned them for her last public appearance at London's Royal Albert Hall in June of 1997. The sale for the matching diamond and pearl necklace and earrings will be held at the Pierre Hotel in New York.
This necklace was once worn by the magnificent Princess Diana and represents, in all likelihood, the only jewelry of hers that will ever be sold. She attended a gala opening of the performance of Swan Lake at London's Royal Albert Hall, where she was patron of dance. It was a glorious occasion. She was photographed tens of thousands of times. She could not have looked more beautiful, totaling 178 beautifully matched diamonds that total approximately 52 carats. We have 7 South Sea pearls, all to a design that Diana had input with, that was made for her by Garrard, the very, very fine English jeweler. This necklace was made for her and given to her for that occasion. It was returned after that special evening because the jeweler, Garrard, and the Royal Crown jeweler of England hadn't completed making the earring. But here, how do you compare the only jewelry of Diana's that will ever be sold? It's hard to say. 5 million, 10 million, 15 million, anything is possible. But we think of these jewels as really extraordinary and priceless.
And that's our program for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Susan Illian. See you tomorrow.